The heat in Montgomery County didn't just sit on your skin. It crawled inside you, made a home in your lungs, and squeezed until breathing felt like punishment. Ruth had known that heat all her life. 32 years under the Alabama sun, 32 years of cotton bowls that cut your fingers raw, and overseers who smiled when you bled. The McKinley plantation stretched across 400 acres of red clay and misery, bordered by the Tallapoosa River on the east and a pine forest so thick it swallowed sound. The big house sat at the center like a white tomb, 2 stories of painted wood and shuttered windows that watched everything. Behind it, the slave quarters, 12 cabins made of rough-hewn logs and dirt floors where 43 souls lived in a silence that wasn't peace, just exhaustion. Ruth's cabin was the third from the end. She shared it with her son Samuel and 2 other women, Ida and Bessie, both field hands like herself. Samuel was 12, tall for his age, with his father's broad shoulders and Ruth's careful eyes. His father had been sold south 3 years prior, taken in chains to a sugar plantation in Louisiana after he'd spoken back to an overseer. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Ruth never spoke of him. Speaking made things real, and some things were easier carried in silence. It was a Tuesday in late September when everything changed. The morning had started like any other, the bell ringing before dawn, the shuffle of feet toward the fields, the smell of smoke from the cook fires mixing with the damp earth. Ruth tied her head wrap tight, kissed Samuel's forehead, and walked with the others toward the cotton that never seemed to end. Samuel didn't work the fields yet. At 12, he was considered house help, fetching water, chopping wood, running errands for Miss Caroline, the master's wife. It was lighter work, and for that, Ruth thanked God every night, though she knew it wouldn't last. In a year, maybe 2, he'd be out there beside her, bent double in the sun until his back forgot how to straighten. Master John McKinley was a tall man with a soft belly and hard eyes. He'd inherited the plantation from his father and ran it the way he ran everything, with a firm hand and a quick temper. He didn't drink often, but when he did, the whole plantation held its breath. His wife Caroline was a thin woman with a painted smile who spent her days in the parlor, embroidering pillowcases and pretending she didn't hear the screams from the barn when discipline was handed out. That morning, something went missing. Ruth heard about it from Bessie, who'd heard it from the kitchen girl who'd been standing outside the parlor when Miss Caroline started shouting. A silver pocket watch, engraved with the McKinley family crest, a gift from the master's father, worn every Sunday to church. It had been sitting on the dresser in the master bedroom that morning, and by noon it was gone. The master tore through the house like a storm, furniture overturned, drawers emptied, rugs pulled up. He questioned every house slave, his voice rising with each denial. When no one confessed, his jaw tightened, and Ruth knew what was coming. She'd seen it before. When white folks lost something, black folks paid for it. They called Samuel into the parlor at 2:30. Ruth was in the fields when she heard the bell, 3 sharp rings that meant stop working. Come now. Her stomach dropped. That bell only rang for 2 reasons. Someone had died, or someone was about to be punished. She dropped her sack and ran, her bare feet slapping against the hard earth, her heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. By the time she reached the big house, a crowd had already gathered. The other slaves stood in a half-circle near the front porch, eyes down, bodies tense. Overseer Jennings stood to the side, coiled whip in hand, his face blank as stone. And there, in the center of it all, was Samuel. He was on his knees in the dirt, hands bound behind his back, his face streaked with tears. Master McKinley stood over him, the missing watch dangling from his fingers. "Found it in his pocket," the master said, his voice cold and flat. "Thought he could steal from me. Thought I wouldn't notice." "I didn't take it," Samuel's voice cracked, high and desperate. "I swear, master, I didn't—" "Quiet!" The word was a whip crack. Samuel flinched, his whole body trembling. Ruth pushed through the crowd, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, Master McKinley, please. He's just a boy. He wouldn't—" "Step back, Ruth." Jennings moved to block her, one hand on her shoulder, firm but not rough. He didn't look at her. None of them did. "He didn't steal nothing," Ruth's voice broke. "He don't even know what that watch is worth. He wouldn't—" "I said step back." Master McKinley turned to face the crowd, the watch still swinging from his hand like a pendulum. "Let this be a lesson," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been too soft, too lenient, and this is what it gets me, thieves under my own roof." "I'm not a thief," Samuel sobbed. "Please, I'm not—" The master nodded to Jennings. Two men stepped forward and dragged Samuel to the whipping post near the barn. A thick oak beam sunk deep into the ground, darkened with old bloodstains that wouldn't wash out. They tied his wrists above his head and tore his shirt away. His back was smooth, unmarked, a child's back. Ruth screamed. She didn't mean to, but the sound tore out of her like something with claws. She lunged forward, and this time Jennings didn't just block her. He shoved her back hard enough that she stumbled and fell. Ida caught her, held her tight, whispered, "Don't, you'll make it worse." But how could it be worse? Master McKinley stepped forward, taking the whip from Jennings. He rolled his shoulders, testing the weight of it, and Ruth felt her whole body go numb. She'd been whipped before. She knew what it felt like, the fire, the tearing, the way your mind tried to leave your body but couldn't. But this was her son, her baby. 20 lashes, the master said. The first strike split the air before it split skin. Samuel screamed, his voice high and thin, and Ruth felt it in her chest like a blade. The second strike came before the echo of the first had faded. Then the third, the fourth. By the 10th, Samuel had stopped screaming. His head hung forward, his body limp against the post. Ruth couldn't look away. She tried. God, she tried. But her eyes wouldn't close. She watched every strike, felt everyone in her own flesh, and something inside her began to crack. By the 15th, the crowd had gone silent. Even the birds had stopped singing. By the 20th, Samuel wasn't moving at all. Master McKinley stepped back, breathing hard, sweat darkening his shirt. He handed the whip back to Jennings and wiped his hands on a kerchief. "Cut him down," he said, "and someone clean up this mess." They untied Samuel and let him fall. His body hit the ground like a sack of grain, and Ruth broke free. She ran to him, fell to her knees, gathered him into her arms. His skin was hot, slick with blood, his eyes half open but unfocused. "Samuel," she whispered, rocking him. "Baby, look at me, look at Mama." He didn't respond. His chest rose once, twice, then stopped. Ruth's scream was a sound no human throat should make. They let her hold him until the sun went down. No one came near. No one spoke. When the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Ida and Bessie gently pulled her away. They wrapped Samuel's body in an old quilt and buried him behind the quarters, near the edge of the pine forest, where the earth was soft. There was no marker. There was never a marker. Ruth didn't cry at the burial. She didn't speak. She stood over the shallow grave with her hands at her sides, staring at the mound of red dirt, and felt something inside her go cold and still. That night, she lay in her cabin and stared at the ceiling. Ida and Bessie whispered in the corner, their voices low and careful. Ruth didn't hear them. She was listening to something else, a voice that didn't speak in words, a voice that came from the coldest part of her heart. It said, "You know what you have to do." She rose in the darkness, moving slow and silent. She walked to the big house, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The back door was never locked. The master didn't fear his slaves. Why would he? They were his property, his tools. Ruth stepped inside. The kitchen was dark, but she knew every inch of it. She found the knife, a heavy blade used for butchering pigs, sharp enough to split bone. She held it in both hands and felt its weight. Then she climbed the stairs. The stairs didn't creak. Ruth had walked them 100 times, carrying trays of food, buckets of water, baskets of laundry. She knew which boards groaned and which stayed silent. Tonight, she needed silence. The hallway on the second floor stretched long and narrow, lit only by moonlight filtering through a window at the far end. 4 doors, 2 guest rooms that hadn't been used in years, Miss Caroline's sewing room, and the master bedroom at the end. Ruth moved like a shadow, the knife pressed flat against her chest, her heart beating so slow and steady it frightened her. She should have been shaking, she should have been terrified. But all she felt was that cold, spreading numbness, like ice water in her veins. Samuel's face floated in her mind, not his face from today, broken and bloodied, but from last week, when he'd smiled at her across the dinner table, proud because he'd learned to write his own name. The master bedroom door was half open. Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening. Inside, she could hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. The room smelled of bourbon and tobacco and something else. Lavender water that Miss Caroline dabbed on her wrists. The scent made Ruth's stomach turn. She stepped inside. The room was larger than the cabin where Ruth had lived her entire life. A 4-poster bed dominated the center, draped with mosquito netting that hung like ghostly curtains. A dresser stood against one wall, topped with silver-backed brushes and crystal bottles. On the bedside table, a half-empty glass of bourbon sat next to a melted candle. Master McKinley lay on his back, one arm flung above his head, his mouth slightly open. His chest rose and fell with each snoring breath. Miss Caroline slept beside him, turned on her side, her back to her husband, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spilled honey. Ruth stood at the foot of the bed, the knife heavy in her hands. She stared at the master's throat, pale skin, visible even in the dim light, the pulse of life beating just beneath the surface. One cut, that's all it would take. One deep, decisive cut, and he would never hurt anyone again. But her hands wouldn't move. She thought of Samuel's eyes, wide and pleading as they dragged him to the post. She thought of his voice, cracking as he swore his innocence. She thought of the way his small body had gone limp in her arms, still warm, but already gone. Already somewhere she couldn't follow. The knife trembled. "Do it," the cold voice whispered. "Do it for him. Do it for every child who will come after him. Do it, because if you don't, this will happen again and again and again." Ruth stepped closer. The floorboards stayed silent beneath her feet. She reached the side of the bed, standing now just inches from the master's sleeping form. This close, she could smell the bourbon on his breath, could see the grey stubble on his jaw, could count the lines around his eyes. He looked old, tired, almost human, but she'd seen what he did. She'd watched him tear her son's flesh with a whip, watched him walk away after without a backward glance, watched him sit down to dinner an hour later and eat roasted chicken while Samuel's blood dried on his hands. Ruth raised the knife. For a moment, the world held its breath. The moon hung frozen in the window. The crickets outside went silent. Even the master's snoring seemed to pause. Then Ruth brought the blade down in one swift, brutal motion. The steel bit deep, opening his throat from ear to ear. Blood erupted in a hot, dark fountain, spraying across the white sheets, the pillows, Ruth's hands and arms and chest. The master's eyes flew open, wide and shocked, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to scream, to breathe, to understand what was happening. His hands came up, clutching at his throat, but there was too much blood, too much damage. The life drained from his eyes in seconds, his body convulsing once, twice, then going still. Miss Caroline woke with a gasp. She sat up, saw the blood, saw Ruth standing there with the knife, saw her husband's body twitching in its final moments. She opened her mouth to scream. Ruth looked at her, just looked, and something in Ruth's eyes, something vast and terrible and utterly empty, made Miss Caroline's scream die in her throat. The white woman pressed herself back against the headboard, her hands clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "He killed my son," Ruth said. Her voice was calm, quiet, almost conversational. "For something he didn't do. He killed my baby and made me watch." Miss Caroline's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "You watched too," Ruth continued. "Stood right there on the porch and watched. Didn't say a word, didn't lift a finger." She looked down at the knife in her hand, at the blood dripping from the blade onto the expensive carpet. "I wonder if you'll remember this moment. I wonder if you'll see it every time you close your eyes. The way I see my son." She turned and walked out of the room. Miss Caroline didn't move, didn't scream, didn't do anything but stare at her husband's body as the blood soaked into sheets that would never come clean. Ruth descended the stairs, walked through the kitchen and stepped out into the night. The knife was still in her hand. She looked at it for a moment, then dropped it in the grass near the back door. Let them find it. Let them know what she'd done. She walked toward the slave quarters, but stopped halfway there. She couldn't go back, not now, not ever. That life was over. She'd killed it along with the master. Instead, she turned toward the river. The Tallapoosa River ran fast and cold, swollen from recent rains. Ruth stood on the bank, her feet sinking into the soft mud, and stared at the black water rushing past. The current was strong enough to pull a person under, strong enough to carry a body all the way to the Alabama River, then down to Mobile Bay, then out to the Gulf of Mexico, where no one would ever find it. She could walk into that water. She could let it take her. She could be with Samuel again, wherever he was, in whatever came after this life of pain and chains, but something stopped her. She thought of the other women in her cabin, Ida, Bessie, the young girls who hadn't yet learned to keep their eyes down and their mouths shut. She thought of the children still running between the cabins, still believing that somehow, someday, things might be different. She thought of every person who'd been bought and sold and broken on this plantation, and 1,000 others like it. If she died now, they would say she was crazy, driven mad by grief. They would say she deserved what happened to Samuel because she'd raised him wrong, taught him to steal, failed to keep him in his place. They would use her death to justify everything, the whips, the chains, the children torn from their mother's arms. But if she lived and disappeared, became a ghost story, a warning, a nightmare that kept white men awake at night. That would mean something. Ruth turned away from the river. She walked north, toward the pine forest that stretched for miles, dense and dark and easy to disappear into. Behind her, she heard the first screams from the big house. Miss Caroline, finally finding her voice, shrieking for help. The plantation would wake now. The overseers would come running. They would find the master's body, find the knife, and within minutes they would know who'd done it. They would search the quarters first, then the fields, then the woods. They would bring dogs and guns and torches, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. But Ruth had a head start, and she knew these woods better than any white man ever could. She'd gathered herbs here, hunted rabbits, hidden in the shadows when the overseers got too rough and she needed a place to breathe. The forest knew her. It would protect her. She ran. By dawn, the entire county knew what had happened. The slave Ruth had murdered Master John McKinley in his bed, cut his throat while he slept, and vanished into the night. The sheriff organized a search party, 20 men on horseback, a pack of bloodhounds, enough rope to hang 12 people. They combed through the slave quarters first, questioning everyone, but no one had seen Ruth leave. No one had heard anything. No one knew where she'd gone. They searched the woods next, but the pine forest was vast and the undergrowth thick. The dogs picked up Ruth's scent near the river, then lost it in the water. Some said she'd drowned herself. Others swore she'd been picked up by abolitionists and smuggled north. A few whispered that the devil himself had come to claim her, that she'd made a bargain in blood and he'd taken her as payment. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Ruth became a story, then a legend, then a ghost. Slaves on other plantations spoke her name in whispers, half in fear and half in awe. Some said she'd made it to freedom. Others said she still haunted the McKinley plantation, walking the fields at night, searching for her son. The master bedroom was never used again. Miss Caroline moved to the guest room, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ruth standing over her husband's body, saw the blood, saw those terrible empty eyes. Within 6 months, she'd sold the plantation and moved to Charleston to live with her sister. The new owners tried to make the big house livable, but the slaves refused to work after dark. They said they heard things, footsteps on the stairs, crying from the fields, a woman's voice calling a name that made their blood run cold: Samuel. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore was not a man who believed in ghosts, but he was beginning to believe in the power of fear. In the 3 weeks since John McKinley's murder, his county had descended into chaos. Plantation owners were sleeping with loaded pistols under their pillows. Overseers were doubling patrols. Every unexplained sound, every shadow that moved wrong, sent white folks reaching for their guns. The slave population, on the other hand, had gone quiet. Too quiet. They worked with their heads down and their mouths shut, but Whitmore could feel something simmering beneath the surface. A kind of electricity in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Ruth had become something bigger than herself. She was proof that the unthinkable could happen, that the hierarchy everyone took for granted, white over black, master over slave, man over woman, could be shattered in a single violent moment. Whitmore stood in the master bedroom of the McKinley plantation 3 weeks after the murder and stared at the blood-stained bed. They'd tried to clean it, but the blood had soaked too deep. The mattress would have to be burned, the whole room would have to be gutted and rebuilt, and even then he suspected no one would ever sleep here again. "Sheriff?" Deputy Collins appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He was young, barely 20, and he'd gone pale the first time he'd seen the crime scene. "We found something." Whitmore followed him downstairs and out to the edge of the property where the pine forest began. 3 men stood in a small clearing, their horses tied to nearby trees. On the ground before them lay a piece of cloth, faded blue homespun, torn and muddy, the kind of fabric used for slave clothing. "Found it caught on a branch about a mile into the woods," Collins said. "Looks like it's been there a while." Whitmore knelt and examined the cloth. It could have belonged to anyone, but something about it felt right. Ruth would have been running blind that night, crashing through underbrush in the dark. It made sense that she'd torn her clothes. "Get the dogs," he said. The bloodhounds picked up a scent almost immediately. They pulled their handlers deeper into the forest, baying and straining at their leashes, following an invisible trail only they could detect. Whitmore and his men followed on horseback, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, their guns drawn and ready. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The pine trees grew so close together that even midday felt like dusk. The air grew thick and humid, filled with the buzz of insects and the distant call of birds. Whitmore found himself looking over his shoulder more than once, feeling as though they were being watched. After 2 hours, the dogs stopped at the edge of a ravine. It was steep and narrow, choked with kudzu and wild grapevines, the bottom lost in shadow. The dogs whined and paced at the edge, but refused to go any further. "She went down there," one of the handlers said, pointing to a spot where the vegetation looked disturbed. "But I ain't taking my dogs down that, liable to break their legs." Whitmore dismounted and approached the edge, peering into the darkness below. "How deep is it?" 20, 30 feet, maybe. Hard to tell with all that brush." "Send 2 men down. See what's there." 2 of the younger deputies exchanged glances, neither wanting to volunteer. Finally, Collins sighed and began tying a rope around his waist. Another man, a thick-shouldered farmer named Dawson, did the same. They lowered themselves over the edge, using roots and vines as handholds, their boots slipping on the loose dirt. It took them 10 minutes to reach the bottom. Whitmore watched from above, listening to the rustle of leaves and the occasional curse as one of them lost their footing. Then silence. "Collins?" Whitmore called down. "What do you see?" A pause. Then, "Sheriff, you better come down here." The bottom of the ravine was darker and cooler than the forest above, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and standing water. A small stream trickled through the center, barely more than a creek, feeding into a pool of still, black water. Collins and Dawson stood at the edge of the pool, staring at something half submerged in the mud. Whitmore made his way down the rope, his boots hitting the bottom with a wet squelch. "What is it?" Collins pointed. There, at first, Whitmore couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like a bundle of rags, or maybe a dead animal. Then his eyes adjusted, and he realized what he was looking at. A body, or what was left of one. The corpse was face down in the mud, partially covered by leaves and debris. It had been there for weeks at least, judging by the state of decay. The skin had turned black and bloated, the flesh torn in places where animals had been feeding. But the clothes were unmistakable. Faded blue homespun, the same fabric they'd found on the branch. And tied around what remained of the head was a strip of red cloth, the kind women used as head wraps. "Jesus," Dawson whispered, turning away. Whitmore approached slowly, covering his nose and mouth with his kerchief. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and rotten and wrong. He crouched beside the body, studying what he could see without touching it. Female, definitely. Medium build, the right age, and the position, face down in the water, arms spread wide, suggested she'd either fallen or thrown herself into the pool. "Is it her?" Collins asked. Whitmore straightened, his knees cracking. "Could be. Can't say for sure without a closer examination." He looked around the ravine, at the steep walls and the thick vegetation. She could have been running, lost her footing in the dark, and tumbled down here. Broke her neck in the fall, or drowned in the pool. Either way. He trailed off, staring at the body. Either way, Ruth was dead. The woman who'd killed John McKinley, who'd become a legend in less than a month, had died alone in the darkness, just another body feeding the Alabama earth. It should have felt like justice. It should have felt like closure. But standing there in that dark ravine, looking at the ruined corpse of a woman whose name he'd heard whispered with equal parts fear and reverence, Whitmore felt only a deep, unsettled unease. "Get some men down here," he said finally. "We'll bring the body up, take it back to town for identification. If it's her, we'll bury her, and that'll be the end of it." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. They brought the body up that afternoon, wrapped in canvas and strapped to a horse. The ride back to Montgomery took 6 hours, and by the time they arrived, word had already spread. A crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Plantation owners, their wives, curious townspeople, and in the back, careful to stay separate, a small group of free black men and women who watched with unreadable faces. The town doctor, a grey-haired man named Pritchard, examined the body in the back room of the jail. Whitmore waited outside, smoking a cigarette and watching the crowd through the window. After an hour, Pritchard emerged, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. "Well?" Whitmore asked. "Female, 30s, medium build, been dead at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. Hard to say with the decomposition. Cause of death?" He paused, frowning. "Could have been the fall, could have been drowning, and could have been exposure, take your pick. But could it be Ruth?" Pritchard shrugged. Could be any slave woman who ran off and died in those woods. Without dental records or distinguishing features, there's no way to know for certain. But if you want my opinion," he leaned closer, lowering his voice, "I'd say it's her. The timing's right, the location's right, and I found this caught in what was left of her clothing." He held up a small object, tarnished and mud-covered but unmistakable, a silver pocket watch engraved with the McKinley family crest. Whitmore stared at it. "How?" "She must have taken it from the master's room that night. Proof of what he did, maybe. Or just—" Pritchard shrugged again. "Who knows why people do what they do when they're dying?" Whitmore took the watch, turning it over in his hands. The engraving was still visible beneath the tarnish. J. M. McKinley, 1815. The same watch that had supposedly been stolen. The same watch that had gotten Samuel killed. "I'll announce it tomorrow," Whitmore said finally. We'll say we found Ruth's body in the woods, that she died fleeing justice. We'll bury her in the potter's field and consider the matter closed. And if people don't believe it, then we'll make them believe it." The announcement was made the next morning from the steps of the county courthouse. Sheriff Whitmore stood before a crowd of nearly 200 people and declared that Ruth, the slave who'd murdered John McKinley, had been found dead in the woods, justice served by the hand of God and the wilderness. Her body would be buried that afternoon in an unmarked grave, and the matter would be considered closed. The white portion of the crowd cheered. The black portion stayed silent, their faces carefully blank. That night, back at the McKinley plantation, the new overseer, a hard man from Georgia named Cutler, gathered the slaves in front of the quarters and made his own announcement. "That woman who killed Master McKinley is dead," he said, his voice carrying across the dark field. "Found her body rotting in a ravine. That's what happens to murderers. That's what happens to thieves and runaways and anyone else who forgets their place. You remember that. You remember what happens when you step out of line." He waited for a response, but got only silence. The slaves stared at him with empty eyes, their faces revealing nothing. Cutler felt a flicker of unease. He'd worked on plantations from Virginia to Mississippi, and he'd never seen slaves look quite like this. Not defiant. Defiance he could handle. This was something else, something waiting. "Get back to your cabins," he snapped. "And if I hear anyone speaking that woman's name again, you'll answer to my whip." The slaves dispersed without a word. Cutler watched them go, then turned and walked back to the overseer's cabin, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Behind him, in the darkness between the quarters, two women stood watching. Ada and Bessie, Ruth's cabin mates, the women who'd held her back while Samuel was beaten, who'd pulled her away from his grave, who'd woken that morning 3 weeks ago to find her gone. "You think it's really her?" Bessie whispered. Ida was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Don't matter if it is or it ain't. What matters is what she did. What matters is that she did it and got away, at least for a while. That's something they can't take from us. They sayin' she's dead. Maybe she is. Maybe she ain't." Ida looked up at the big house, dark and empty on the hill. "But I've been hearing things at night, footsteps, crying. And yesterday, when I was bringing water up to the house, I saw something in the master bedroom window. A shape, a shadow. It was just for a second, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know. Maybe I'm going crazy." "Or maybe," Bessie said slowly, "maybe she ain't as gone as they think." The two women looked at each other in the darkness, and something passed between them. Not quite hope. Hope was too dangerous, but something like it. Something that had been missing for so long they'd almost forgotten what it felt like. The knowledge that the world could change, that it had changed, that a woman could take a knife in the dark and rewrite the rules, even if only for a moment. And whether Ruth was alive or dead, whether she'd drowned in a ravine or made it north to freedom, she'd left something behind. A crack in the foundation, a whisper in the dark that said, "You don't have to accept this. You don't have to stay silent. You can fight back." It was a dangerous whisper, a deadly one, but once heard, it was impossible to forget. The body they buried in the potter's field was already decomposing beyond recognition, wrapped in canvas and lowered into the red Alabama clay without ceremony. No marker, no mourners, just Sheriff Whitmore, Deputy Collins, and 2 men from the county work crew who filled in the hole without meeting anyone's eyes. "That's that then," Whitmore said, brushing dirt from his hands. "Case closed." But it wasn't. 3 nights after the burial, the screaming started. It began at the McKinley plantation. Overseer Cutler woke just past midnight to the sound of someone sobbing. At first, he thought it was coming from the slave quarters, maybe one of the women having a nightmare or grieving for some loss. But as he sat up in bed listening, he realized the sound was closer than that. It was coming from inside the big house. Cutler pulled on his boots and grabbed his pistol. The house had been empty since Miss Caroline left, no one willing to live in the master bedroom where the murder had taken place. The downstairs had been maintained by day workers, but at night the building stood dark and silent. Or it should have been silent. Cutler crossed the yard, the pistol heavy in his hand, and approached the back door. It stood slightly ajar, though he was certain it had been locked. He pushed it open slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked, and stepped into the kitchen. The sobbing was louder now, coming from upstairs, a woman's voice, broken and raw, crying as though her heart had been torn out. The sound made Cutler's skin crawl. He'd heard slaves cry before, God knows he'd given them reason to. But this was different. This was a sound that came from somewhere deeper than pain, somewhere darker than grief. He climbed the stairs, his boots loud on the wooden steps, the pistol raised. The hallway stretched before him, darker than it should have been, as though the moonlight couldn't quite penetrate the shadows here. The sobbing grew louder with each step, leading him inexorably toward the master bedroom. The door was open. Cutler stopped in the doorway, his heart hammering. The room was empty. No furniture, no curtains, just bare walls and the stained floorboards where they'd torn up the blood-soaked carpet. But the sobbing continued, filling the space, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" Cutler's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Show yourself!" The sobbing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Cutler stood in the doorway, pistol raised, scanning the empty room. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but he could feel it, a presence, thick and suffocating, like standing in a room full of people you couldn't see. Then slowly, the air in front of him began to shimmer. At first, he thought it was heat distortion, the way air bends over hot pavement, but it was too cold for that, and as he watched, the shimmer began to take shape. A figure, tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like dark cloth, a woman. She stood in the center of the room, her back to him, her head bowed. Even though he couldn't see her face, Cutler knew with absolute certainty who she was. "Ruth," he whispered. The figure turned. What Cutler saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a face, not anymore. It was something else, something broken and wrong, with eyes that were too dark and too deep, eyes that held an ocean of rage and grief, and something colder than death. The figure opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was not crying, but accusation, a wordless howl that made Cutler's bones ache. He fired the pistol. The gunshot was deafening in the empty room. The bullet passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke, embedding itself in the far wall. The figure didn't flinch. It began to move toward him, gliding across the floor without footsteps, and Cutler did the only thing his panic-stricken mind could conceive of. He ran. He bolted down the stairs, through the kitchen, out into the yard, running faster than he'd ever run in his life. Behind him he could hear that terrible howling, following him into the night. He ran all the way to his cabin, slammed the door, and shoved a dresser in front of it. Then he sat on the floor with his pistol in his lap, shaking so hard he could barely hold it, and waited for dawn. By morning, the entire plantation knew something had happened. Cutler wouldn't speak of it, but his face had gone grey and his hands shook when he tried to light his pipe. The slaves whispered among themselves, their whispers spreading from cabin to cabin like wildfire. "She's back. Ruth's back. And she's angry." That night, 2 more overseers from neighboring plantations reported similar experiences. One claimed he'd seen a woman standing in his cotton field at midnight, her dress soaked in blood. When he approached, she'd vanished. The other swore he'd heard footsteps following him through the woods, and when he'd turned around, he'd seen a shadow shaped like a woman with a knife in her hand. Within a week, the rumors had spread across the entire county. The slave Ruth, who'd murdered John McKinley and died fleeing justice, had returned, not as flesh and blood, but as something else, a ghost, a haunt, a vengeful spirit that walked the night, searching for something. Some said she was looking for her son. Others said she was hunting for more masters to kill. A few whispered that she was neither alive nor dead, that she existed in some terrible in-between space, trapped by the violence of her death and the rage that had driven her to murder. Plantation owners began sleeping with lamps burning all night. Overseers refused to patrol after dark. Slaves spoke Ruth's name in whispers that were half prayer and half invocation, as though calling to her might bring protection or vengeance or both. And in the big house on the McKinley plantation, strange things began to happen. The first was the bloodstains. No matter how many times they scrubbed the floorboards in the master bedroom, the stains kept reappearing. They would fade during the day, growing pale and ghostly, then darken again at night until they looked fresh and wet. The workers tried sanding the boards down, tried painting over them, tried tearing them up entirely and replacing them with new wood. The stains came back. Then there were the sounds, footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, doors opening and closing by themselves, the sound of sobbing that seemed to come from the walls, and worst of all, a voice, quiet, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to make out the words, "Samuel, my baby, Samuel." The day workers refused to enter the house after the third occurrence. The night workers had already quit. Eventually, even the slaves who maintained the property during daylight hours began to avoid the place, crossing themselves as they passed and whispering prayers under their breath. The new owners, a wealthy merchant family from Mobile named Pemberton, arrived in November to take possession of the plantation. They'd bought it at a significant discount, aware of its history, but confident that with new management and a firm hand, they could restore it to profitability. They lasted 6 days. Marcus Pemberton was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of the superstitious nonsense that seemed to plague the rural South. He believed in hard work, discipline, and the natural order of things. When his wife Eleanor expressed concern about the plantation's reputation, he'd laughed and told her that slaves loved to tell ghost stories. It was how they entertained themselves, how they exercised what little power they had. "Pay it no mind," he'd said. "Once we establish proper authority, these foolish rumors will disappear." The first 3 days were uneventful. The Pembertons moved into the big house, Eleanor fussing over the placement of furniture, while Marcus met with Cutler and the other overseers to discuss improvements to productivity. The slaves watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. On the 4th night, Eleanor woke to find a woman standing at the foot of her bed. She was tall and thin, wrapped in a dark dress that looked like it had been dragged through mud. Her head was covered with a red cloth, and her hands hung at her sides, fingers too long and too pale. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at Eleanor with eyes that reflected no light. Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came out. She reached for Marcus, shaking his shoulder, her throat working soundlessly. He rolled over, mumbling something, then opened his eyes and saw what she was seeing. The woman at the foot of the bed tilted her head, a movement that was somehow both curious and predatory. Then she opened her mouth, and instead of a voice, what came out was the sound of a child screaming, high and desperate and full of pain that no child should ever experience. Marcus bolted upright, grabbing for the pistol he kept on the nightstand. His hand closed around empty air. The gun was gone, though he was certain he'd placed it there before bed. The woman took a step closer, and now Marcus could see her more clearly. Her dress wasn't just muddy, it was torn and blood-stained. Her hands weren't pale, they were covered in something dark and wet that dripped onto the floor. And her face. Her face was Samuel's face, a 12-year-old boy's face, frozen in the moment of death, eyes wide and mouth open in a silent scream. The Pembertons ran. They fled the bedroom in their nightclothes, raced down the stairs, and didn't stop until they were outside in the yard, gasping and clutching each other. When they finally found the courage to look back at the house, they saw a figure standing in the master bedroom window, a dark silhouette that watched them with patient, terrible stillness. They left at dawn, taking only what they could carry, and never returned. The plantation was put up for sale again, but this time no one would buy it. The big house stood empty, slowly falling into disrepair, while the fields around it continued to be worked by slaves who knew better than to enter the building after dark. And every night, without fail, the sobbing could be heard. A woman crying for her lost child, searching through the empty rooms, calling a name that would never be answered. Samuel. My baby. Samuel. 6 months after Ruth's body was found in the ravine, a traveling preacher named Josiah Wells arrived in Montgomery County. He was a tall black man, with gray in his beard, and a Bible worn soft from use, one of the few free men of color who dared travel the Deep South preaching to slave congregations with the grudging permission of their owners. Wells had heard the stories about Ruth. Everyone had. From Virginia to Louisiana, slaves whispered her name like a prayer or a warning. The woman who'd killed her master and disappeared into legend. The ghost who haunted the McKinley plantation, crying for her murdered son. But Wells knew something others didn't. He knew that legends were dangerous things, that they could obscure truth as easily as they could preserve it. And he knew that in the spaces between what people said happened and what actually happened, important details could be lost. So he started asking questions. His first stop was the slave quarters at the McKinley plantation. The current overseer, a nervous man who'd replaced Cutler after Cutler quit and moved back to Georgia, gave him permission to preach on Sunday afternoon. Wells stood in the shade of an old oak tree and delivered a sermon about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, about how God heard the cries of the oppressed and delivered them from bondage. The slaves listened with carefully blank faces, responding with Amen at the appropriate moments, but revealing nothing. Wells had expected this. He'd been preaching to slave congregations for 20 years, and he knew how deep their distrust ran, how careful they had to be about what they said and who they said it to. After the sermon, he sat with the older women and asked if anyone had known Ruth personally. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Ida, Ruth's former cabin mate, stood up. She was in her 50s now, her face lined with decades of hard work and harder memories, but her eyes were sharp and clear. I knew her, Ida said quietly. Lived in the same cabin with her for near 10 years, watched her son grow from a baby to... She stopped, her jaw tightening. To what he became. Wells nodded, pulling a small journal from his coat pocket. Would you tell me about her? About what really happened that night? Ida looked around at the other women, at the men standing at a distance, at the overseer's cabin on the hill. Then she gestured for Wells to follow her. They walked to the edge of the quarters, near the pine forest, far enough from listening ears. What do you want to know? Ida asked. The truth, Wells said simply. I've heard a dozen versions of this story, and I suspect most of them are lies. I want to know what Ruth was really like, what Samuel was really like, and what actually happened that night. Ida was quiet for a long moment, staring at the trees. When she spoke, her voice was low and steady. Ruth was a good woman, quiet. Kept her head down, did her work, never caused trouble. She loved that boy more than anything in this world. Used to save half her food for him, even when she was starving. Taught him his letters in secret, even though it was against the law. She had dreams for him, foolish as that sounds. Thought maybe someday he'd be able to buy his freedom, make something of himself. And the day he died? Wells prompted gently. Ida's face hardened. That watch didn't go missing on its own. Master McKinley had been drinking heavy that week ever since his brother died. He was looking for someone to hurt, and Samuel was convenient. That boy never stole nothing in his life. He was too scared, too careful. But someone put that watch in his pocket, and I got my suspicions about who. Who? Master's nephew, Martin Hendricks. He'd been staying at the house that month, helping with the books. Young man, maybe 25, with a mean streak and an eye for causing trouble. He didn't like the way Samuel looked at him, too direct, not humble enough. I think he planted that watch just to see what would happen. Wells wrote this down. Did anyone tell the sheriff this? Ida laughed, a bitter sound. Tell the sheriff? A slave's word against a white man's nephew? We'd have been whipped for even suggesting it. No, we kept our mouths shut and watched that boy die. And Ruth? Ruth broke that night. Something inside her just snapped. I saw it happen. She was holding Samuel's body, rocking him, and her face went from grief to something else, something cold and empty. I knew right then she was going to do something terrible. Did you try to stop her? How could I? Ida's voice cracked. What was I supposed to say? Don't kill the man who murdered your son? Turn the other cheek? Wait for justice? She shook her head. There ain't no justice for us, preacher. You know that. You've seen enough to know that. So no, I didn't try to stop her, and when she was gone, I was almost glad. Wells looked up from his journal. Glad. Glad that someone finally did something. Glad that for once a white man paid for what he did to us. Glad that she had the courage to take a knife and... Ida stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Lord, forgive me, but yes, I was glad. Wells spent the next 3 days interviewing everyone who would talk to him. He spoke to Bessie, who confirmed Ida's account. He spoke to the field hands who'd witnessed Samuel's whipping. He spoke to the house slaves who'd seen the master's body the next morning. And slowly, a picture began to emerge that was more complex than the legend suggested. Ruth had killed Master McKinley. That much was true. But the watch that supposedly got Samuel killed, it had been planted. The whole thing had been orchestrated by Martin Hendricks, who'd bragged about it to another house slave the day before the whipping. Said he was teaching the boy a lesson, an old man named Tobias told Wells. Said Samuel had been getting uppity, needed to remember his place. Master McKinley was drunk and angry, and Hendricks knew exactly what would happen if he put that watch in Samuel's pocket. So it was murder, Wells said quietly. Premeditated murder of a child. In the eyes of God, maybe. In the eyes of the law, Tobias shrugged. A slave ain't fully human in the eyes of the law. Killing one is like breaking a tool. There's a cost, but it ain't murder. Wells felt sick. He'd known this, of course, had known it his entire life, but hearing it stated so plainly still made his stomach turn. And the body they found in the ravine, he asked. Was it really Ruth? Tobias's expression turned cagey. They said it was. But was it? The old man looked around, then leaned closer. You know how many slave women go missing every year? How many run off and die in the woods, or get sold away, or just disappear? Could have been anybody in that ravine. Could have been Ruth. Could have been someone else. You don't think it was her? I think, Tobias said carefully, that Ruth was smart. Smarter than the white folks gave her credit for. I think if she wanted to disappear, she'd know how to do it. And I think maybe, just maybe, someone helped her. Helped her how? But Tobias wouldn't say more. He just smiled, a small, secret smile, and walked away. Wells's final interview was with Miss Caroline McKinley herself. She'd returned to Montgomery for a brief visit to settle some remaining financial matters related to the plantation, staying at a hotel in town rather than at the house. It took Wells 3 days to arrange a meeting, and when he finally sat across from her in the hotel parlor, he was struck by how much she'd aged. She was only 40, but she looked 60. Her hair had gone almost completely white, and her hands trembled constantly. She kept glancing toward the windows, as though expecting to see something there. You want to know about that night, she said. Before Wells could even ask his first question, her voice was flat, almost dead. Everyone does. The night my husband was murdered. I want to know the truth, Wells said gently. Whatever you can tell me, Caroline laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The truth. The truth is that I'm haunted, preacher. Not by Ruth, though God knows I see her face every time I close my eyes, but by my own cowardice. She stared at her trembling hands. I knew what my husband was. I knew he was cruel. I knew he took pleasure in causing pain. And that day, when he beat that child to death, I stood on the porch and watched. I could have stopped it. One word from me, and he might have listened. But I didn't say anything, I just watched. Why? Wells asked. Because I was afraid, Caroline whispered. Afraid of him. Afraid of what he'd do if I questioned him. Afraid of losing my position, my security, my comfortable life. So I let a child die to protect myself. She looked up at Wells, and her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. When Ruth came into our bedroom that night, when she stood there with that knife, do you know what I felt? I felt relief. Because finally, someone had the courage to do what I couldn't, to stop him. Wells wrote carefully, "You didn't try to stop her." No. I watched her cut his throat and I did nothing. Just like I'd done nothing when he killed Samuel. And afterward, when she looked at me, when she told me I'd watched and done nothing, she was right. She was absolutely right. Did you see which direction she went? Caroline hesitated. She went toward the river. I saw her from the window, walking slowly, like she had all the time in the world, but then she frowned. Then something strange happened. She stopped at the edge of the pine forest, and someone stepped out of the trees. Another woman. They spoke for a moment, and then they both disappeared into the darkness. Wells leaned forward. Another woman? Did you recognize her? No. It was too dark and I was in shock. I didn't even remember it until weeks later. It seemed like a dream, but you're certain you saw it. I'm not certain of anything anymore, preacher. Caroline stood up, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. All I know is that I deserved what Ruth did to my husband. And if she's still out there, if she survived, then good, let her be free. God knows she earned it. Wells left Montgomery County 3 days later with a journal full of interviews and a head full of questions. He'd learned that the official story, Ruth murdered her master, fled into the woods and died in a ravine, was almost certainly false, or at least incomplete. The body in the ravine could have been anyone. The watch found on the body could have been planted, just like the watch that got Samuel killed. And if Caroline McKinley was right, if there had been someone waiting for Ruth in the woods that night, then it was possible she'd had help. Possible she'd escaped. But to where? Wells turned his attention north. He began visiting the stations along the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and sympathetic souls who helped runaway slaves reach freedom in the North. He spoke to Quakers in Pennsylvania, abolitionists in Ohio, conductors in Indiana, and slowly, very slowly, he began to hear whispers. A woman matching Ruth's description had been seen in Kentucky in early 1840, tall, thin, with scars on her back and a haunted look in her eyes. She'd stayed at a safe house for 3 days before moving on. Another report from Illinois, a black woman with a red head wrap who'd asked directions to Canada, said she was looking for a fresh start. A third from Detroit, a woman working in a boarding house, quiet and careful, who never spoke about her past, but had nightmares that made her scream in her sleep. Were they all Ruth, or were they just wishful thinking, the desperate desire to believe that someone who'd suffered so much could still find freedom? Wells didn't know, but he wrote it all down, every rumor and whisper, every possible sighting. And when he was finished, he had a document that told 2 stories. The official story: Ruth murdered her master and died fleeing justice, her body found in a ravine and buried in a potter's field. A cautionary tale about the consequences of violence and rebellion. And the unofficial story: Ruth killed the man who murdered her son, escaped with help from her community, and made her way north to freedom, leaving behind only legends and hauntings. A story of resistance, survival, and the power of grief transformed into action. Which story was true? Wells suspected both were in their own way, because the truth was always more complicated than any single narrative could capture. Detroit, Michigan, November 1843. 4 years after Samuel's death. The boarding house on Gratiot Street catered to free black workers and escaped slaves making their way to Canada. It was run by a Quaker woman named Margaret Ellis, who asked no questions and kept meticulous records that she burned at the end of each month. The house was always full, laborers from the docks, washerwomen, domestics, people passing through on their way to something better. In the back room on the second floor, a woman named Rachel worked as a cook and housekeeper. She'd arrived 4 years prior, thin and haunted, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small cloth bundle that she never let out of her sight. Margaret had taken one look at her and known exactly what she was. A runaway. A woman running from something terrible. "Can you cook?" Margaret had asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you keep your mouth shut about the people who come through here?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you have a job, and a name if you need one. I won't ask what you were called before." The woman had hesitated, then said, "Rachel, you can call me Rachel." It wasn't her real name. Margaret knew that, but names were funny things. You could shed them like old skin, put on new ones that fit better. Rachel seemed as good as any. For 4 years, Rachel had lived quietly in the boarding house. She cooked meals, changed linens, scrubbed floors, and spoke to no one unless spoken to. She was good at her work, reliable and efficient, but there was something about her that made people uneasy, a distance in her eyes, as though she was always looking at something no one else could see. She had nightmares. Margaret heard them sometimes when she passed Rachel's room late at night, screams that would suddenly cut off, followed by the sound of quiet sobbing. Once she'd knocked on the door, concerned, but Rachel had called out that she was fine, voice steady and calm, as though she hadn't just been screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Margaret never asked what Rachel dreamed about. She figured everyone in this house had their own demons. That was the price of surviving. On a cold November evening, a man arrived at the boarding house. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, with the careful manners of someone used to navigating white society. He gave his name as Josiah Wells and said he was a traveling preacher doing research on the slave experience. Margaret was immediately suspicious. Preachers asking questions usually meant trouble, but Wells showed her letters of introduction from Quaker congregations in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and his demeanor seemed genuine. She agreed to let him stay for a few nights. Wells spent his first 2 days interviewing the other residents, taking careful notes. On the third evening, he was sitting in the dining room after dinner when Rachel came in to clear the dishes. He watched her work with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, her movements precise and economical. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Josiah Wells." Rachel glanced at him briefly, then looked away. "Rachel, I work here. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions for my research? I'm trying to document the experiences of—" "No." The word was flat, final. Wells nodded, respecting her boundary, but as Rachel turned to leave, he said, "I was in Alabama a few years ago, Montgomery County. Heard some fascinating stories there about a woman named Ruth." Rachel's hands tightened on the dishes she was carrying, but she didn't turn around. "They said she killed her master after he beat her son to death," Wells continued, his voice casual but watchful. "Said she disappeared into the woods and died fleeing justice. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think maybe she survived. I think maybe someone helped her." Rachel stood very still for a long moment. Then, without turning around, she said, "Why would you think that?" "Because I spoke to people who knew her. And I don't believe a woman that smart, that determined, would have stumbled into a ravine and drowned. I think she made it out. I think she's somewhere safe, living under a new name." And if she did," Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, "what business is it of yours?" "None at all," Wells said honestly. "I just wanted her to know that people remember, that slaves across the South tell her story, that she gave them something they desperately needed, proof that resistance is possible, that justice, even imperfect justice, can be achieved." Rachel turned slowly. Her face was composed, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. And what if the woman you're looking for doesn't want to be found? What if she's spent 4 years trying to forget, trying to build a new life, and your questions are just tearing open old wounds? Then I'd apologize, Wells said softly, and leave her in peace. But I'd also tell her that her son's death meant something, that his name is remembered, that Samuel's story is being told alongside hers, and people are asking questions about justice and what it really means. At the sound of her son's name, Rachel's composure cracked. She set down the dishes with trembling hands and sank into a chair, covering her face. For a long time, she said nothing, just sat there, shaking silently. Wells waited, not pushing, just present. Finally, Rachel lowered her hands. Her face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. His name was Samuel. He was 12 years old, and he never stole nothing. They put that watch in his pocket because the master's nephew wanted to teach him a lesson about knowing his place. And when they beat him, when they tied him to that post and tore his flesh to ribbons, he kept saying, I'm innocent, until he couldn't say nothing at all. Wells nodded, writing nothing, just listening. I held him while he died, Rachel continued, felt his heart stop beating against my chest, and something in me died with him. The part that believed in patience, in endurance, in waiting for God to deliver justice, that part just broke. So you took the knife. So I took the knife, Rachel agreed, walked right into that house, up those stairs, and cut his throat while he slept. I ain't proud of it. I ain't ashamed neither. It was just necessary. Like breathing. And then I ran. But I didn't make it far before Ida found me. She'd been following, watching to make sure I got away. She took me to a house on the edge of the county, a Quaker family who helped runaways. They hid me for 2 weeks while the search parties went by. And the body they found, Rachel's expression darkened. Woman named Clara. She'd tried to run a month before, got caught, and they beat her so bad she never recovered. She died the night before I killed the master. Ada and some others took her body and dressed it in my clothes, put it in that ravine where they knew the search parties would find it, made sure the master's watch was in the pocket so they'd think it was me. Wells sat back, absorbing this. So you've been here ever since? I've been lots of places, moved every few months at first, scared they'd track me down. But after a year, when nobody came, I started to settle. Margaret needed help, and this place... Rachel looked around the dining room. This place is full of people like me, people running from something, trying to become someone new. I fit here. And the nightmares. Rachel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I see him every night. Samuel. Sometimes he's alive, smiling at me the way he used to. Sometimes he's dying, begging me to save him. And sometimes... She paused. Sometimes he tells me I did the right thing, that he's proud of me. I don't know if that's my mind trying to comfort itself or if it's really him, but either way, I'll carry him with me until I die. Wells closed his journal. For what it's worth, I think he would be proud. And I think what you did took incredible courage. It wasn't courage, Rachel said. It was just rage and grief and the absolute refusal to let his death mean nothing. If I'd been brave, I'd have done it before they killed him. I'd have found a way to protect him. You can't protect children from a system designed to break them, Wells said gently. No mother can, no matter how strong or brave. All you can do is survive and remember. Is that enough? I don't know, but it's what we have. Wells left Detroit the next morning. Before he went, Margaret handed him a letter. From Rachel, she said. She wanted you to have it. Wells opened the letter on the train. Inside, in careful, painstaking handwriting, the letters of someone who'd taught herself to write in secret, late at night, risking punishment for the privilege of literacy, was a message. Dear Preacher Wells, thank you for telling me that people remember Samuel. That means more than you know, but I need you to understand something important. I am not a hero. I am not a symbol. I'm just a woman who loved her son and couldn't save him, so I did the only thing I could think of to make his death mean something. The stories you've heard about me being a ghost haunting that plantation, let people believe them. Let them think I'm still there, walking those fields, crying for my boy, because that fear, that superstition, it's a kind of power. It makes the masters sleep a little less soundly. It makes them look over their shoulders. It reminds them that their cruelty has consequences. But me? I'm just Rachel now. I work in a boarding house in Detroit. I cook meals and change linens and try not to think too much about Alabama. I help people who come through here on their way north, give them food and a safe place to sleep, and sometimes I tell them about Samuel, about who he was before they killed him. That's my resistance now, not violence, not vengeance, just memory. Just making sure that every person who died under slavery is remembered as a whole human being, not just a statistic or a ghost story. Tell their stories, Preacher Wells. Tell all of them. And when you tell mine, tell the truth, that I was a mother who broke, who killed, and who survived. Nothing more, nothing less. Rachel Wells kept that letter for the rest of his life. He incorporated Ruth's story, both the legend and the truth, into his sermons and his writings. He told audiences across the North about Samuel, the 12-year-old boy who'd been murdered for a crime he didn't commit, and about Ruth, who'd taken terrible vengeance and then disappeared into legend. Some people called her a murderer, others called her a hero. Wells simply called her what she was, a human being pushed beyond endurance, who'd done something unforgivable and understandable in equal measure. The haunting at the McKinley plantation continued. For decades, people reported seeing a woman in dark clothes walking the fields at night, hearing sobbing from the empty house, feeling an oppressive presence in the master bedroom where John McKinley had died. The plantation changed hands several times, but no one ever stayed long. Eventually it was abandoned entirely, the big house falling into ruin, the fields reclaimed by kudzu and wild grass. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, Union soldiers camped on the property reported seeing the ghost, a tall black woman with a knife, standing silent guard over the ruins. Some said she was protecting the place, making sure it would never be a plantation again. Others said she was warning them, a reminder of what this land had been built on, what sins it held. By the time slavery ended, the legend had taken on a life of its own. Ruth became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even under the most brutal oppression, people could fight back. Her story was told in whispers, in songs, in coded messages passed along the Underground Railroad. She became myth and memory intertwined, a ghost who haunted the conscience of a nation built on stolen labor and spilled blood.